Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 750 for January 18th, 2019. This time around, I'm in Victoria, British Columbia, with the first of two episodes this weekend from the 14th annual Victoria Whisky Festival at the Hotel Grand Pacific. Coming up in just a few minutes.
I'm rather fed up of hearing from some of the big distilling groups that their paean always starts, well, there's no scientific evidence to prove that terroir exists. And so that was a stimulus to actually do something about it, to try and find out whether it really does or not.
Terroir may be one of the most controversial subjects in whiskey right now. It's a concept familiar in wine, and its proponents say the character of the land can shape the character of a whiskey. But when whiskeys are made from grains grown all over the place, it's hard to say that terroir makes a difference in most whiskeys. Waterford Distillery founder Mark Reynier is one of the biggest advocates of terroir, and his distillery in Ireland is making terroir a focus by using grains from local farmers, then malting, distilling, and maturing each farmer's grain separately to maximize the impact of terroir. I'll talk with Mark Reynier later on WhiskyCast In-Depth, and we'll also hear from one of the winners in last night's Canadian Whisky Awards with a whiskey that also has its own terroir. That's coming up later on, along with the calendar of events, the What I'm Tasting This Week department, and much more. All on this episode of WhiskyCast from Victoria, British Columbia.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by Highland Park. And once again, we have to look at whiskey and politics. The British Parliament's overwhelming vote Tuesday night to reject Prime Minister Theresa May's Brexit proposal has Scotch whiskey makers reaching for their headache remedies. That's because the chances are greater than ever that the UK will crash out of the European Union in a little more than 2 months from now without any kind of a divorce agreement in place. The potential impact on the Scotch whiskey industry alone could be millions of pounds a year, according to Graham Littlejohn of the Scotch Whisky Association.
A no deal must be avoided at all costs. It would really put significant cost complexity into the production and export of Scotch whisky, not only to our biggest regional market in the EU, £1.3 billion to the EU in 2017, but also it would have an impact on some of our global markets where there are currently EU free trade agreements, which helps us to get Scotch whisky to some of those key and upcoming global markets. And we're trying to get continuity of those trade deals once we leave the European Union. But if we leave with a no deal, that doesn't look likely to be an option. So that means in markets like South Korea, where there was a 20% tariff and that it's been reduced to zero as per that EU trade deal, that tariff would go back up to 20%. Other markets, Dominican Republic, Morocco, where there are EU free trade agreements in place now that has benefited the industry. If we lose the benefits of these free trade deals, we estimate that it would be an annual cost of around £50 million to the industry, which is something we can do without when we're trying to build our global footprint.
It's also the worst-case scenario on both sides of the Irish border, since a no-deal Brexit would likely mean the reimposition of a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. That could result in delays for shipping grains and bottled whiskies between Ireland and Northern Ireland, in addition to the tariff issues. The Irish Whisky Association's William Lavelle also predicted this week that Brexit could cost the industry even more as a weaker pound and the border issues impact tourist traffic from the UK to Ireland's distilleries. Around 923,000 people visited Irish distilleries during 2018. That's up 13% from the previous year. A year ago this week, we reported on the British Columbia government's decision to crack down on the province's enforcement of its liquor laws. That's when BC liquor inspectors raided the 4 Scotch Malt Whisky Society's partner bars and seized hundreds of bottles of SMWS whiskeys. Those cases are still pending, with an enforcement hearing scheduled in March for Fett's Whiskey Kitchen in Vancouver, which had around $40,000 of whiskey seized. The province has yet to implement any of the recommendations that came out in a report commissioned after the raids, including one that bars, hotels, and restaurants, so-called hospitality licenses, be allowed to buy their liquor directly from private liquor stores. BC law currently requires them to buy all of their whiskeys, wines, and other spirits directly from the province's liquor distribution branch and pay retail prices, meaning the private stores have to charge more than the province's own retail stores just to pay the bills. Thursday, Canada's Competition Bureau weighed in on the controversy, sending a letter to BC Attorney General David Eby calling for changes in the current system. Associate Deputy Commissioner of Competition Layla Wright says consumers would also benefit from a change in provincial policy.
I don't think that I need to tell you that there are some really unique and interesting products out there that are being made by whiskey distilleries across Canada as well as across the world. And right now those distilleries can sell to the province's stores as well as private retailers. They can't sell to restaurants and bars, and those restaurants and bars can only buy from the province's stores. So if the province's stores don't pick up the products aren't getting to restaurants and bars. And that has implications for competition at a number of different levels. But the bottom line is that it's better for consumers to be able to have these products offered at bars and restaurants across BC.
How much influence do you actually have with the province since the provinces control their own alcohol regulation?
Well, when provinces are making these types of policy decisions, there are a lot of different considerations that they have to take into perspective. And our job is to really provide that competition perspective. And so you'd have to ask the province how much influence that gives, how much influence we have. But we're hoping to provide a perspective that is unique and that gives them a little bit more information about how their rules are affecting competition.
We have asked the British Columbia Attorney General's office for a response to the Competition Bureau recommendations, but have yet to receive one. Before that report, though, a spokesman for the Ministry of the Attorney General told us in an email that the government is still working through the recommendations in last year's report and declined to make anyone available for an interview here in Victoria. Attorney General David Eby told Canada's Global TV on Thursday that his staff and the province's liquor regulators have been tied up with a more pressing issue.
The legalization of cannabis happened at the same time, and we have been full out on dealing with that in terms of licenses, supply, and the provincial regime. It's the same policy people.
Global TV also reports that the union representing workers at the province's liquor distribution agency and its retail stores opposes the policy change. Meanwhile, the Canadian Whisky Awards were presented last night here in Victoria. 40 Creek returned to the top of the awards for the first time since 2013, as its 22-year-old rye whiskey was named the Canadian Whisky of the Year. It's a whiskey you've probably never heard of, since only a few bottles have been sold so far. 40 Creek whiskey maker Bill Ashburn worked alongside founder John Hall ever since the distillery opened, then took over as whiskey maker after John sold the distillery to Campari nearly 5 years ago.
I can honestly say I took it from the grains all the way to bottling I even bottled it myself because no one else wanted to participate in this project. It was a 22-year experience.
Explain how this came about in the first place, because none of us knew it was even going on. John never talked about this either.
Well, the problem is when I first distilled this liquid, John and I both tasted it, and we thought it was the most horrid thing we'd ever tasted in our lives. I was supposed to blend it off, but instead I stuck it in a couple barrels. It was about 4 barrels, and I forgot about it. It wasn't until about 5 years ago that we drew samples out of it and went, wait a minute, this stuff might have some potential. 5 years later, the liquid is absolutely fantastic.
I understand this is all bottled up somewhere, and none of it's actually hit the market yet, right?
There is a very limited number of bottles that have been released to the market at this point. We're hoping within the next few days the rest of it will be released. It's sitting in the LCBO's warehouse, waiting to be released.
And they have it all, right?
They have it all. Other than the bottle that's at my bar at my house.
And that's not going anywhere?
No, it is not.
The 40 Creek 22-year-old rye is listed on the LCBO's website in Ontario for about $225 Canadian a bottle. That's around $169 US. By the way, John Hall was the keynote speaker at the awards ceremony Thursday night. It's the first time he's been here at the Victoria Whisky Festival since the sale. And while 40 Creek took the overall top honor, Hiram Walker & Sons was named Distiller of the Year for the second straight year. The Corby-owned distillery also took home a bunch of medals and awards. Master blender Dr. Don Livermore is going to need an extra checked bag to carry all of that hardware home to Windsor, Ontario.
Yeah, it was a fantastic evening. It just shows the hard work of the team members at our distillery, of the fine whiskeys that they make. It is a team effort when we make whiskeys, right from the start to the very end. I think it shows with the medals that were won here tonight, and with the Gooderham Awards and the Pike Creek, the JP Weisers and Lot 40 brand names. They're all fantastic names, and it shows their hard work and efforts here tonight.
One of the awards you got for Best Line Extension was for this NHL Alumni Series that we've talked about before. When are we going to see the next 3 releases in this one? Because you've got 3 more coming before the playoffs, right?
I understand there will be 3 more coming before the playoffs. They're very exciting, the 3 that are. It's going to be the Larry Robinson, the next Montreal Canadian player, Paul Coffey, starting with the Edmonton Oilers and the Detroit Red Wings, and the third one that's coming out will be Darryl Sittler for the province of Ontario, certainly the captain of the Leafs. So we should see them shortly in the spring, and it's quite exciting. I mean, I get asked across the country about these line extensions, and when's mine coming to my city? When's coming to my city? And we'll see where it goes. It's very exciting.
You caught some heat with the first 3 because they were only available essentially in Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta, where the 3 players, Guy Lafleur, Wendell Clark, and Lanny McDonald played. You going to try to change that this time around?
Yes, so it's going to be changed this time around, which I think everybody across Canada, as we know, there's fans of hockey. You can be in any province and cheer for any team, and I think that's what we realized for the second release of them.
And it would be remiss of me not to ask about this other edition, this gritty edition I keep seeing on Twitter.
Yes, I want to talk to that designer. That was a fantastic design. If you can hook me up with them, Mark, I'd love to.
Guilty as charged. Yes. I couldn't resist.
That was fantastic. I love that. That was great. And that's you know what? That's essentially what whiskey is having fun with each other, the conviviality, and that's great. It's awesome.
But you could do a whole mascot series too.
Yeah, you absolutely could. I mean, you could really roll it out and do lots of different things. You can transcend other sports and stuff as well. I mean, this is a great industry, the whiskey industry, and certainly the Canadian whiskey industry with everyone here tonight. What a fantastic evening, the camaraderie and the conviviality everyone has.
I should explain that a couple of weeks ago, I created a parody version of the Alumni Series bottle featuring Gritty, the Philadelphia Flyers' new mascot. You can see it on our social media feeds. And one of John's colleagues at Corby actually asked us if they could use it for an April Fool's prank. Too late, though. You'll find a complete list of winners in the Canadian Whisky Awards at canadianwhiskey.org. And full disclosure, I served as one of the judges in this blind tasting competition for the 9th straight year. In other news, we've had another shakeup in the executive ranks. Berry Brothers and Rudd CEO Dan Jago is stepping down. He and the company announced this week that he is leaving after 3 years on the job. In the statement, Jago and Berry Brothers chairwoman Lizzie Rudd said that he had accomplished his goal of restructuring key parts of the company and that it was time for new leadership. Lizzie Rudd will take over as the interim CEO until a replacement is named. No word on Dan Jago's future plans as of now. And finally, distilling has resumed at Sazerac's Glenmore Distillery in Owensboro, Kentucky, while state investigators continue to look into a fatal accident at the distillery on Monday. 44-year-old Dennis Lehman died after falling from an elevated walkway at the distillery. According to Sazerac, Lehman had been working at the facility since 2017. That's just some of the whiskey news so far this week. We'll have more news, including details on some of the week's new releases, on our second episode of WhiskyCast this weekend from the Victoria Whisky Festival. The news is brought to you by Highland Park, the Orkney single malt with Viking Soul. If you're not a member yet of the Highland Park Inner Circle, well, what are you waiting for? It's the fastest way to get details on exclusive Inner Circle releases, contests, and all the news from Orkney. Best of all, it's free. Sign up today and check out the entire lineup at highlandparkwhiskey.com. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. Tickets are still available for the Scotch Malt Whisky Society U.S. Chapter's Burns Dinners in New York City this coming Monday and Tuesday nights. The Whiskey Lounge in the UK kicks off a series of Burns night tastings around England this coming Tuesday night in Sheffield, along with Wednesday in Liverpool and Thursday in York, with others through the weekend. The Kentucky Derby Museum in Louisville, Kentucky kicks off its 2019 Bourbon Legends series with the folks from Michter's this coming Thursday night, the 24th. And the Balvenie hosts a Burns night tasting at London's TT Liquor on the 25th, which is, of course, Burns night. Also in London that night, Glen Grant's Dennis Malcolm is the guest of honor at a Glen Grant tasting in the Whiskey Exchange's Fitzrovia store. And Casey's Irish Pub in Los Angeles will host a Teeling whiskey tasting and dinner February 1st. Right now, we have 203 different events on the searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. Just click on the search button to find one near you or wherever you're traveling during 2019.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Lagavulin. Terroir is one of those things that's a bit hard to describe, since it doesn't have a natural translation from French into English. Essentially, it's the concept that the character of food, wine, or even some whiskeys is influenced by the surrounding environment. It's most often discussed in wine, where all of the grapes that went into making a specific wine may have usually come from the same vineyard. It's harder to quantify, though, in whiskey, since very few whiskeys can be said to have all of the grain that was used to make them come from the same farm. Last night, Vancouver Island's Shelter Point Distillery won the Award for Innovation in the Canadian Whisky Awards for its Shelter Point Montfort DL 141 whiskey. It's distilled from 100% unmalted barley, and Shelter Point's Leon Webb says all of the grain came from the distillery's own farm.
It's something we're very proud of because we're showing the provenance of BC And we're showing for the first time what BC is capable of in terms of growing its own grain. We've got beautiful water from the glacial-fed streams from above, and great air quality as well. So all the ingredients are there for great whiskey, and the Montford shows provenance better than any other of our whiskies.
Give me the logic behind the name.
The name rolls off the tongue, as you can imagine, Montford District Lot 141. But the reason we've called it that name is because it defines the very field from which the barley was grown. So you can actually check the coordinates on the back of the bottle, and you can pinpoint exactly where that barley was grown. And we've had people come to the farm with their smartphones and look around the farm for the exact spot where that barley came from.
Was this only sold in BC?
It's been sold in BC, Alberta, but we do have plans for growth and future editions to be available further afield, but that will come with time.
I'll have my tasting notes for it in a much shorter time, in just a few minutes. We're still waiting for Ireland's Waterford Distillery to release its first whiskey, a little more than 3 years after Mark Reynier and his team fired up the stills for the first time. Reynier has been a thorn in the side of whiskey traditionalists ever since he and his partners bought Bruichladdich Distillery and brought it back to life in 2001. He was making the arguments for terroir at Bruichladdich years before anyone else applied it to whiskeys, and when he opened Waterford in 2015, he started out with terroir in mind. The farmers he works with grow their barley knowing that it'll be malted, distilled, matured, and perhaps even bottled separately from other farms. And Reynier's team has released preliminary scientific data showing that there may actually be a terroir influence, if you want to go to the expense that it takes to make that influence felt in the final whiskey.
It's part of a long project, and we're trying to make sure that we this is going to be peer reviewed. It's going to be it's a proper scientific project. We've got the Chagas, which is the Ministry of Agriculture, Irish Ministry of Agriculture Department, sponsoring us and involved in it. We've got the help from the our maltsters and from Tafflick & Thompson, who's a whiskey analyst in Scotland, and some very fancy gas chromatography, mass spectron assistance from the University of Cork. So we've set this up to prove, because you wouldn't believe it, no one has actually really ever bothered to prove whether terroir actually exists. The French have done, followed this for years. The markets, the wine markets, the vignerons, they all know it. It's just taken for granted. So no one's actually bothered to scientifically prove it. And I'm rather fed up of hearing from some of the big distilling groups that their paean always starts, well, there's no scientific evidence to prove that terroir exists. And so that was a stimulus to actually do something about it, to try and find out whether it really does or not. And we know taste-wise, and we know the prices we're prepared to pay for wines and this, like that. We know, and as you know, I've been a wine merchant for half my career. I've owned a Grand Cru vineyard in Burgundy. I don't need convincing, but clearly others do. So I was surprised to find a piece of research done a year before last now, in Oregon University by a young lad called Dr. Dustin Herb, who was doing research for crop and barley variety development purposes. And part of his research, reading through it, I was very interested in what he was doing. It's trying to identify the genes that produce the flavors that we like in specific barley varieties, and then seeing if the seed industry could then sort of produce a sort of greatest hits. And so in this project, I realized that sort of part of that process was he'd actually demonstrated that terroir existed. So I asked him over to Ireland, and he came over, and we talked about it, and he was fascinated about my reasonings and what I wanted to do. And so he helped us set up this project with those people I've just mentioned. And we've taken it to the first step, so we're sort of halfway now. And the first half shows that the two sites that we chose, Athy and Buncloddy, with two different varieties grown in both places, shows that there is a difference in the terroirs of the two places. And of course, in a project such as this, you've got to make sure that you exclude all possible variables, and so it's extremely detailed analysis that's been done. But where we are at this stage, we can say that terroir does exist. Now, we don't want to preempt the full project. We've got another set of samples being analysed from this year, so we're doing it across two harvests, just to make sure that there's no possibility that it was a fluke or anything like that. So when we actually have the second set analysed in the autumn, and we will be ready really about this time next year to release the full study.
Now, the question I have is that you found very similar characteristics in terms of some of the flavor attributes that were tested between the two spirits, but we're talking about new make spirit here. We're not talking about mature whiskey.
No. That's absolutely true. And we as you know, we grow. We use roughly 40 farms a year at Waterford, and we distill them separately, and we keep the barley separate from the field right through to the barrel. We've been extremely fastidious about this. It's all about the logistics, being able to keep it separate, and for the doubters and everything, we have to be able to prove that we've kept them separate all the way. So we have this huge logistical setup to support this traceability, this overt traceability in this project. So we haven't converted the project; we started that way. So we have it laid out right from day one. And we and you and anybody who has been to the distillery knows the differences of the different spirits. Sure, we've got different varieties, but we've also got fundamentally different terroirs. My feeling has always been that terroir is something. It's there if you want to look. If you don't want to look, you want to put fingers in the air and cover your eyes and see no evil, hear no evil. Sure, then you can say, oh well, no, it's this, it's that. It's there if you care to look. And I know for a lot of doubters out there, it's a bit of folklore, it's a bit of French Hollywood, blah blah blah, and that's what all the wine guys said in Napa back in the 80s when they started. Oh, terroir, it's a load of nonsense, blah blah blah. But not now. Not now. It's not. Not now that they've discovered their own terroirs throughout Sonoma and Napa. So I think it's something which is easy to knock and easy to doubt, and it's certainly complicated enough to understand. And you have to sort of be open-minded. And our aim is to show people that terroir, of course, it exists. Gardeners know it exists. Farmers know it exists. They just call it gardening and they call it farming. And of course, we've got this airy-fairy word, which there is no real translation, direct translation, which of course creates a bit of doubt.
Allow me to play devil's advocate for a second. I'm not going to argue that there's terroir between individual fields, individual farms. Yeah. But when you get to the point where you're on a macro scale of a large distilling company that's not segregating out fields and barley by specific fields and farms, as you guys are, and they're mixing together malted barley from a bunch of different farms to make their whiskey, that the terroir effect is going to be minimized by using multiple farms, multiple regions of Scotland, multiple countries.
Of course.
And so for that reason,
It's
they make the
not a
argument that
regional
terroir
thing.
doesn't exist because of that.
Yeah, of course. It's a specific. It's not a generic. So what I think is amusing is to see, and you'll see a lot of this. The marketing guys grabbing hold of the concept of terroir and twisting it to their purposes. So what's going to happen is that this word terroir is going to be corrupted, as they always do. I think it'll be quite amusing to sit and watch how this word is appropriated. It's like cultural appropriation here, and twisted and turned and ultimately devalued. And it serves two purposes. One is it sounds French and it sounds exotic, so therefore let's use it. And then on the other hand, if you can corrupt it and make it valueless, well then that screws it up for for people that really are interested in terroir. So I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword. I think we're going to see this battle played out. But your question was, does it show any difference in the mature spirit? Well, yes, it does. Do bear with us. We've only been doing this, for 3 years now. So we don't have an ancient old library of samples to fall back on. But what we do have is over 80 separate terroirs now in our portfolio. Not every farm we've continued with, and some have come along, and so all in all, we've got about 80 different terroirs to compare and contrast. It's a riveting project, as you know. When you next come along, to play the game and see for yourself. Anybody who comes to Waterford is very, very welcome to try for themselves. Don't believe me. Stick your own nose in a glass. Taste your own. Trust your own senses, and you'll be astounded. I'm not saying that any one farm is better than another. I'm not saying that this is the way forward for everybody. No, of course not. This is just a very interesting. Terroir is something that I've been brought up to understand. So I'm a convert. I don't have to discover anything. This is merely putting into effect what we already knew. What we did at Bruichladdich and tried and tested to varying degrees of efficacy. It's taking it a step further. So I personally find it, astounding. It excites me that we can make 40 different versions of Waterford whiskey a year, and watch them develop and grow differently. It's real fun. If you're going to lay down whiskey, boy, is it fun to do it this way, I can tell you.
It almost seems like terroir is about as easy to define as umami.
Yeah. To me, it's that yes, they are. They're ingredients. They're ingredients for which we can then have, and Ned is having one hell of a time. Where do you start to put together a definitive bottling of Waterford when you've got all these components? I don't know if you've ever had the pleasure of going to one of the great chateaus of Bordeaux or even Krug. I remember going to Krug, Remy Krug, and had all the samples out there, 20, 30, 40 different samples of Krug champagne. And he said, Mark, it's really easy with a vintage champagne because God decides on the quality. Not me, it's God that decides. But he said, when I make the Grand Cuvée of Krug, I'm God. And I'll never forget that. I remember sitting there as he put together all the different samples. he put together all the different samples to make the cuvee. And I remember that. Yeah. For the Grand Cuvée, I'm God. And I'm not saying I'm God at Waterford, because it's actually Ned that puts the samples together. So he is having a field day playing with all these different components with their own identities, their own individualities. Some more overt, some more suppressed, some more floral, some more fruity, some all distilled the same way. We've got all the data, so we know exactly how they were distilled. And it's the pinnacle of distilling.
So when are we going to see some of these actually hit the market? You've got 3-year-old juice now.
Well, we're not going to do it now. We're just going to wait a little bit longer. We've got to understand it more. That's the point. We've got to understand what we've created, and that's taking some time. We never intended to release at 3. We made a little at 4, and we don't have to do anything until 5 or 6. So we got plenty of time. We hope to do a small compare and contrast single farm bottling in 220. In fact, 2 lots of 2, so you can compare and see for yourself what the individual components can do. We're very happy to share this experience, this excitement. So the first bottlings will be 2 pairs of 2 single farms in the spring of 220 and the autumn of 220. And you guys can see for yourself, how it can demonstrate itself, this idea of terroir. And then the following year, we'll do a definitive bottling, which will be made up of multi-farms, multi-terroirs. And the whole point being to provide that complexity, layers upon layer upon layer of complexity, like you get with a great wine from Bordeaux or a great champagne. That's the aim of this project, is complexity, layered complexity. And that's the reason why we've done all these single farms, is to provide those individual flavor compounds, and then we can assemble them in a way that provides ultimate complexity.
Mark Reynier is building his new Renegade Distillers rum distillery in Grenada, and he's planning to do something similar with the sugarcane growers who will supply that distillery when it opens up. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Lagavulin, the legendary Islay single malt. Look for the new House Lannister Lagavulin 9-year-old. It's part of the Game of Thrones single malt Scotch whiskey collection from Diageo and HBO. Look for it at a whiskey shop near you, and check out the rest of the Lagavulin single malts at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Let's start off with one of the examples of terroir in a whiskey, the Shelter Point Montfort District Lot 141 single grain whiskey that we heard about a few minutes ago from Leon Webb. It's bottled at 46% ABV. The nose is dusty and dry with notes of toasted bread, subtle spices, raspberries, and hints of oak and honey. The taste has oak tannins, good spicy notes of clove and cinnamon, along with hints of licorice, anise, and touches of honey and caramel in the background to add balance and complexity. The finish, long and gentle with hints of licorice, anise, and honey. I'm scoring the Shelter Point Montfort District Lot 141 single grain whiskey a 92. That one won the award for innovation, but the two brewers, release number 9 from Yukon Spirits in Whitehorse, Yukon, won the award for the best Canadian single malt. It was matured in Pedro Jimenez sherry casks, and it's bottled at 46% ABV. The nose is fruity and complex with tropical fruits, a good maltiness, and subtle spices. The taste, creamy and fruity, but with a nice balance of spices, touches of tropical fruits, and a subtle hint of toffee. The finish, long and fruity with a nice sweetness. I'm scoring the Two Brewers Release Number 9 single malt a 93. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, our tasting notes are brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. 85 years ago, as the end of Prohibition meant a renewed demand for Kentucky bourbon, Ed Shapira and his brothers invested in a new distillery in Bardstown. They bought their partners out later on, and today, that little startup is the largest family-owned and operated distillery. Get the entire history at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. Since we talked about hockey players creating whiskeys earlier with Dr. Don Livermore in the NHL Alumni Series, let's look at one legend that will not be part of that series. That's because the great one, Wayne Gretzky, has his own line of whiskeys under the Wayne Gretzky Estates label. His 99 proof whiskey is finished in Cabernet Sauvignon wine casks, and it's bottled at 49.5% ABV, or 99 proof. The nose has subtle spices, fresh berries, red grapes, and a hint of oak. The taste starts off smooth and fruity at first, then turns tart and spicy with citrus fruits, a hint of clove, fresh berries, and vanilla. The finish is long and fruity with subtle touches of lingering spices. I'm scoring the Wayne Gretzky 99 proof a 93. Finally, I received a sample of the Dewar's 15-year-old blended scotch earlier this week before I left for Victoria. It's referred to as the Monarch, and it's bottled at 40% ABV. The nose has notes of honey, butterscotch, toffee, dried fruits, and hints of baking spices and vanilla. The taste starts off creamy and smooth, followed by a nice buildup of baking spices. Honey and butterscotch lead the palate at first, and touches of citrus and coconut add balance in the background. The spices last through the finish with touches of coconut and dried flowers. Overall, it's a very complex and well-balanced whiskey, and an example of what a good blended scotch can be. I'm scoring the Dewar's 15-year-old a 93. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 2,400 different whiskeys from around the world. You'll find it at WhiskyCast.com.
From deep in the north, far beyond the wall, the howl of the frozen wind brings word of something new. A whiskey from the land of always winter, for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Time now to open up the inbox for your voice. It's brought to you by Lot 40. A couple of comments on the results of the Canadian Whisky Awards. Gary Gilman of Toronto tweeted this: "The best Canadian whiskey I had last year, for what it's worth, is Wendell Clark's selection in the Alumni Series, a Tour de Force rye mash, no grain whiskey, with a fruity geraniol flavor and deep silky mouthfeel. Leather and lace, like some good hockey tactics." You'll find my tasting notes for that one at whiskycast.com. And on 40 Creek's winning the Canadian Whisky of the Year award for its 22-year-old rye, Portwood at Markham Whiskey on Twitter had this response: "I thought 40 Creek had fallen off the whiskey radar. Didn't realize they're releasing 22-year-old rye at Scotch prices." And on our interview last time around with Louise McGuane of Ireland's Chapel Gate Whiskey on the U.S. release of her Flintlock Irish single malt being delayed because the label approval is in limbo due to the U.S. government's partial shutdown, at Myth Placed, tweeted this response. Just listening to the podcast before class and heard that there is some poor Irish whiskey refugees stuck at the American border. Please let them know we Canadians are none to accept without judgment the volume of those bottles. Saves all the work of repackaging. We'll pass that along. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always post it on the Your Voice page at whiskycast.com. Your Voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's wrap things up now with Behind the Label, our look at the science, history, and other stuff that make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. And we have a sad story to tell this time around. You have probably never heard of Dr. Chris Berglund. He was a professor at Michigan State University who created the university's brewing and distilling program many years ago. It was one of the very first degree-granting programs for distillers in the U.S., and dozens of aspiring distillers learned their skills with his guidance. Chris Berglund died suddenly last month at the age of 63, and with a new semester of classes getting underway this month, one of his recent students has stepped up to keep the program going. Dr. Nicole Schreiner took one of his classes as a graduate student several years ago.
After the class was over, he emailed the class and said if anyone is still in the area and is looking for any part-time work, us, meaning Red Cedar Spirits, are looking for some employees. So I jumped right on the opportunity. I thought the fact that you can apply chemical engineering to brewing and distilling, I was like, well, I know where I'm going with my career. So I said, I'm interested. I ended up with the job, and I worked for the entire summer at Red Cedar Spirits. And then he eventually approached me and said, am I interested in grad school? I think you'd be a great addition to my graduate group. And I thought about it for about 5 seconds and said, absolutely. So then I started working with Michigan State as a PhD student, research assistant, and also balancing working at Red Cedar. That eventually turned to just research at Michigan State. And now I finally graduated, and I didn't really know where my career was going to go. I've always thought about, staying with Michigan State and not knowing what that would look like. And we'll see, I guess, what it does look like.
And let's put Dr. Berglund's career into perspective, because he really created, if not the first, one of the first degree programs for craft distillers anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people have referred to him in the past as the godfather of Michigan craft distilling, and that has a lot to do with training people, brew product development, and education from a standpoint of whether that's the workshops that he put on through Red Cedar or across the country, and creating the program at Michigan State. He really got that going.
And the only other program that's even close to being that old is the one at Heriot Watt in Scotland, which, of course, has been around for years. But
right.
Give me an example, or at least some idea of how many distillers have gone through that program that are now working around the country in the U.S. and elsewhere as craft distillers.
Oh, gosh, so many. Definitely a name that I can first think of is John Jeffrey. He's been involved in a lot of distilleries across the country, making award-winning products, and he definitely came straight out of Dr. Berglund's education. There's plenty out there, and there's also some people who. My colleague just graduated last December, and he works out in Gallo in California and wine. So, just the knowledge base that can be applied through the entire industry, not just distilling as well.
What happens to this program now? You've got it for this semester, and as you said, you're going to talk to the faculty and the department after this semester ends. But is there a long-term future for this program without Dr. Berglund around?
I believe so. Obviously, he has a very large, big shoes to fill, but I think that Michigan State knows what they have, and hopefully, I have confidence. And after having one meeting with the department chair, I know that they want to keep the program going. It might look slightly different depending on where funding comes from or who we work with. But I think there's plenty of people in the industry that want to keep it going, as well as Michigan State. It's just going to be how that looks, is questionable for right now.
Chris Berglund's family originally came from Sweden, and he also taught at the University of Luleå in Sweden. He and his wife Diane also founded Red Cedar Spirits, a distillery located just outside of Lansing, Michigan. According to Nicole Schreiner, Diane Berglund is keeping the distillery open with help from some of Dr. Berglund's former students. And we wish her the best of luck, along with our condolences. If you have something you'd like us to look at on Behind the Label, just use the contact form at WhiskyCast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, an 18th century style of premium Irish whiskey, blended from single pot still and single malt. Like yourself, it's one of life's treasured rarities, and what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copper Pot.
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. We've posted links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find links for our WhiskyCast HD videos and the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast, along with the latest whiskey news, events, tasting notes, and a complete archive of all of our past episodes going back to 2005. Thanks to the organizers of the Victoria Whisky Festival for their support in making our special coverage possible once again this year. And don't forget to listen later this weekend for our second special episode from Victoria. We'd love to hear from you. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com. You'll find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2019, and comes to you most of the time from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. But this time around, I'm at the Victoria Whisky Festival in Victoria, British Columbia. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.